Eventide has released two one-knob dials, the De-Boom and the Sheen Machine. De-Boom is all about removing boom and muddiness in the low end. Sheen Machine is all about adding air and, of course, sheen without harshness. At least that is what Eventide claims, and in this video you'll find out if these two plugins make the hell which is your mixing life a bit easier. To put it very simply, the plugins are equalizers, and what makes them special is that they split the audio in two parts. You have the attack or transient and the sustain or tonal part. De-Boom and Sheen Machine will EQ these two parts differently and work mostly on the sustain part. Here's the first example with De-Boom. The kick and bass guitar are a bit conflicting in the low end, and that's mostly the kick which is the culprit. Let's enable De-Boom and turn up the dial. You hear that the boominess of the kick goes away while the thump stays intact. This is exactly what the plugin is doing, working mostly on the sustained part. As a comparison, here is a normal EQ with a similar low shelf cut as De-Boom. Let's go back and forth between De-Boom and the normal EQ. De-Boom keeps the thud and attack of the kick intact, while the normal EQ affects the overall sound of the kick too much, which results in the kick sounding weaker overall. Now I will use Sheen Machine with this acoustic guitar. Focus on what happens in the high end. And here's a normal EQ with a similar boost of the highs. And back and forth.
And let's do the same with Sheen Machine on drums. Pay attention to the overheads and hi-hat.
Sheen Machine indeed adds a sheen, where the normal EQ sounds more aggressive, which makes sense since it boosts everything, including the strong attacks. The processors used in Sheen Machine and De-Boom are the same as what happens in Eventide's Split EQ. In Split EQ you can adjust the transient and tonal part separately from each other. With De-Boom and Sheen Machine you get one dial to change a predetermined and optimized setting. Let's go back to De-Boom. You may have noticed I didn't go past 30 on the dial of De-Boom. Listen what happens if I do. Nothing happens. This is because of how De-Boom works. Turning up the dial doesn't remove the boominess more after that 30 position. What happens is, and that is something you cannot hear on this kick, is that the frequency of the low-end reduction shelf moves up. Up to 30 you have a reduction with the frequency around 200 Hz, and if you turn up the dial it will be centered around 1200 Hz and still somewhat affected to 3 kHz. This is ideal to lower muddiness in all sorts of tracks, and with for instance vocals where there is boominess due to the fact you recorded a voice in a bad acoustic environment. With Sheen Machine something similar happens with the EQ setting. Up until 50 you get a high shelf boost around 10 kHz, with less boost in the transients than the tonal part. Now when you turn up the dial more, you see that this high shelf will move down the frequency spectrum, ending up around 5 kHz. I couldn't get a perfect cancellation. It ended up with something like this. This is around 4.2 kHz. You can see that the transients are less boosted than the sustained tonal part. I used the same frequency point with the normal EQ on the acoustic guitar earlier in this video. One thing I can appreciate from Eventide is that in the manual they mention the amount of delay these plugins cause. It's in samples. 48 kHz for instance has a latency of 3592 samples, which equals 74.8 milliseconds. And that number is also reported by Cubase. So that's correct. This is not something a lot of companies mention. Bonus points for Eventide here. You can do the things which De-Boom and Sheen Machine do with Split EQ. And I think these two plugins are for people who want a simple, effective tool to add sheen and fix muddiness without diving deep into the complexity of Split EQ. Intro price is $25 for each, $19 if you own Split EQ, and the MSRP from next year on will be $49, which seems a bit steep. If you want to know more about Split EQ, watch the video displayed on screen. It's also linked somewhere in the description below.